teachmeet Sociology Icons. My name is Kerry Stratton. I'm an A-level and GCSE sociology teacher in the West Midlands. And I'm here tonight to be your host and to introduce you to some amazing speakers that we've got tonight. I'm just going to go through a few things first before we get onto our keynote with Professor Angela McRobbie, which we're all absolutely thrilled by. So hopefully some of you have seen our first event, which was before Christmas, which we sort of based on research methods and was very much a teach meet. But when we thought about this one, we very much thought about looking at it from a subject knowledge perspective. I personally really enjoyed hearing Les Back talking about his research. And if you've been teaching for, as long as I have, 15 plus years, you graduated a long time ago, so perhaps subject knowledge is not as up to date as it could be, or I'm aware we have a lot of non-specialists. So we decided that subject knowledge was what we wanted to look at. So that is why we have called this event Theory and Perspectives Beyond the Textbook. Because sometimes, the textbooks are a little bit out of date, the research is a little bit older. So it's nice to hear from people who are out there doing research, currently in contemporary society. A couple of other things I want to say. First of all, I'd like to say thanks to our sponsors, Pupil Progress and Wellbe, and we will hear from them a bit later on. I'd like to say thank you to the rest of the Sociology Teach Me Icons team. We have Carly, who's on Twitter. So if you've got any comments or questions or anything, feel free to tweet. I think the YouTube comments is another place where you can comment if you want. And thanks to Kim, who's on tech support tonight. Thank you, Kim. And I'd like to thank all the wonderful speakers that we've got tonight. So we have our keynote, first of all, in a minute with Professor Angela McRobbie. We have Professor Peter Cox talking to us about this, about social theory in everyday life from the University of Chester. We have Jenny Lowen-Jones, who is from the University of Worcester, which is where I did my degree, on the sociology of emotions. We have Dr. Harry Dwyer talking about post-humanism in digital sociology from the University of East Anglia. And we have Dr. Ryan Scotes talking about masculinities from the University of Coventry. So that's, quite a lineup, I think, really interesting things to talk about. Moving on to my introduction for our keynote, who needs no introduction really. She is someone that we were so excited to hear that was going to be speaking with us. We were absolutely thrilled. Her early research was done at the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham. She is a fellow of the British Academy, professor at Goldsmiths, has done some fascinating work on feminism, subcultures, and fashion. I recently listened to the Sociology Show podcast with Angela, and I would definitely recommend listening to that. It's really interesting hearing her talk about her work in a lot of detail. So if we're ready, can we have Angela in the stream, please?
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
Hi. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Welcome. As I said before, absolutely thrilled to have you here. This is a career highlight for me, being able to speak to you. And so with that kind of thought, who would you have liked to have interviewed as a sort of classical sociologist?
Well, that's a great question to start off with. And thinking about it, of course, ideally, I would like to have been able to say 3 or 4 or maybe 5 great women sociologists in the long canon, going back to Durkheim, Weber and Marx. And there I was racking my brain to find a classical female sociologist. And I think that tells us quite a lot about the discipline. And in many ways, I was thinking back to when I was studying at Glasgow University. There were always women teachers, there were female teachers in the sociology department. There have always been a preponderance of female students studying sociology, but going through the ranks to becoming a very active researcher, the numbers, well, they are, of course, since the 80s, they have grown, but I really couldn't immediately think of a fantastic female sociologist of the period of the likes of Irving Goffman, Pierre Bourdieu. So that's really a bit disappointing. But I would say of the classical sociologists that I would like to have met and interviewed, well, I think Durkheim for sure. Marx, well, of course. But actually, I think I would have quite liked to have met the Chicago School of Sociologists. I was always interested in their work. And I was also interested in the work of Irving Goffman, for example. I think he would probably have been extremely interesting to talk to about his research in institutions. And of course, sadly, Pierre Bourdieu died, I think it was in the year 2000. And I did actually meet Pierre Bourdieu once before he died. And he did so many interviews. So I don't think I would have, needed to add to the list of people who interviewed Pierre Bourdieu. And likewise, of course, there have been many interviews with Stuart Hall, and they're widely available. So so that would be my kind of platform of people. One other person who I did actually know very well, and I had great admiration for it, was who sadly also died about 7 or 8 years ago, was Ulrich Beck. And I think it's very well worth going back to the work of Ulrich Beck. And I don't think he did so many interviews, but there is one really excellent article about Ulrich Beck written by Paul Gilroy, and it's in the British Journal of Sociology.
Okay, sorry about this, Angela. Kerry's internet's just cut out, so I'm jumping in here. That was really interesting. I think Ulrich Beck is somebody I'd really like to have spoken to. I think he's a really interesting sociologist, and some of his ideas were very interesting as well. Moving on from that then, how do you feel we could improve getting more female sociologists to be more prominent within our studies and within the A-level and things like that?
Well, I mean, that has been happening now for the last 20 years, and there is a huge volume of work, and I would say probably the majority of sociologists working now in a range of research topics are actually female. So I think there has been fantastic change. But I think really one other issue that comes to mind is that over the decades, most women sociologists have chosen to work in fields that are not necessarily theoretically abstract and nothing else. So they have been working on areas like the family, medicine and health, sociology of art and literature, of course, sociology of gender. So they have also often been working in an interdisciplinary way, so between the borders of sociology and social psychology, or like myself, working within sociology and cultural studies. So, for example, or in media studies. So, my earliest work, for example, on Jackie magazine, I would think of very much as sociological study of the magazine. It was also an analysis of media. So going back to your question about how can we encourage more, I think it's also very much about flagging up the career routes, not necessarily only into research, but the wide range of jobs and the professional opportunities that are available to undergraduates in sociology.
Okay, and just wondering, how do you feel the? Oh no, Kerry's back now, so we can add her back into the stream.
I do apologise. Technology has just failed me.
The sound quality didn't seem to be that good a few minutes ago. I could hear an echo. I don't know how it's working at your end, but there was quite a lot of sound, interruption really there.
Okay, shall I carry on with my questions?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so we are, most of us are A-level sociology teachers. I think there's quite a lot of us who feel that the A-level specification is a little bit out of date, old-fashioned. If you were in charge of rewriting it, what would you include? Which concepts or theories or sociologists do you think are the most important for A-level students to learn about?
Well, that's a really good question. And it's something that I feel really strongly about. Obviously, I've been teaching myself for so long in the universities, and I haven't always had the time to actually look at the A-level sociology syllabus, only dipping into it. But it did strike me that it was really stuck in a groove of Anthony Giddens' structure and agency. And I felt that really is narrow and rigid and not really in the spirit of sociological inquiry and the sociological imagination to move out of those old paradigms of structure and agency. So I would say, as you probably might predict, there's got to be a lot more work on decolonizing the sociology syllabus and really flagging up the major contributions from Black and ethnic minority sociologists. If anybody's work needs to be there more prominently, it's Paul Gilroy, also Bell Hooks, Stuart Hall, Ruth Gilmer, the great theorist of prisons and incarceration, Angela Davis, also the writer. So I think there's no shortage of people whose work I think should be really in the heart of the curriculum. In the UK, I'm also thinking about Gurminder Bambra, who's done a lot of work on rethinking the methodology and methodological whiteness. And so there really is a lot of work coming out that Kimberly Crenshaw, obviously, on intersectionality. So they're the kind of Black, ethnic minority, Asian theorists and empirical work as well that is there. I think really Paul Gilroy's work should be central. I would flag that up, absolutely. But in terms of topics, I think there could be a good bit more on the sociology of gender in a way that clarifies the work. I mean, a lot of, it's a challenge to turn dense theoretical writing, let's say like Paul Gilroy's, which is kind of also historical sociology, into material that is useful to sixth formers and fifth formers. But I think it's not impossible, if one had the time to do it. So I would say the same about Judith Butler's work. It's there, the two books, Gender Trouble, and then the 1993 Bodies That Matter. They're two texts that I think could be turned into very accessible A-level sociology works. And then writers like Bell Hooks are incredibly accessible. And I think the important thing about Black scholarship, and it relates to the point I was making earlier about to me, sociologists have always been interested in a kind of interdisciplinarity. There's a kind of porosity around the edges, whether it's urban sociology, whether it's sociology of literature, sociology of, and the Black writers have always done that. I think, just to finish off an answer to your question, I think my really favorite book of the last 2 years that I think is so important for sociology, and if I've got time, I will try and write an introduction to it, is Wayward Lives by Saidiya Hartman. And we can maybe come back to that at the end of the session, because the point I'm making there is that her argument is that in sociology, and in Black and anti-racist sociology, there isn't the kind of archive of documents, of records of young Black women's lives historically. Those archives don't exist. So she develops her own methodology, which she calls fabulation. She takes photographs, she takes excerpts from girls who were in care or who were imprisoned in New York and Philadelphia in the 1940s, and she crafts a marvelous historical sociology from those works. So I think sociology somehow needs to make more use of this sociological imagination, really. Have more porosity, more openness.
I think that's interesting, and actually the teachmeet Sociology Icons team, when we were planning this event, one of the things that we realised is actually that the speakers we've got, we just don't have the sort of ethnic minority diversity, which is something that we want to work on in the future. So I think that's a really interesting thing that you've said, that we are aware of too.
Oh, good. And I've got one other point to make, which is that there are certain topics that have rarely been on the sociology curriculum. Again, maybe because they're considered ephemeral or associated with femininity. I mean, I consider myself a sociologist of fashion, and I've done lots of empirical work. I've been in the studios, I've done observation, I've done interviews, I've also done theoretical work, but it's rare to find sociology of fashion as having any kind of place in even in the university curriculums. I mean, that's something that I'm making a strong case for. But right now, this is such a big issue. And of course, it's always interesting, particularly to young women, have got a really strong interest in the fashion industry, in supply chains, in exploitation in the global south, in the factories. So really, it's such a major topic that I'm surprised it too hasn't found its way into the curriculum.
I think sometimes we as sociology teachers, if we have a particular interest in something, then we will kind of bring it in a little bit,
Sure.
but obviously not across, it's not universal. When I was listening to the Sociology Show podcast, I was really interested in hearing about some of your older work that you've done with the female punks around Birmingham. Which other subcultures would you have liked to have studied? Are there any newer subcultures? I think there is some argument that sort of the idea of subculture is a little bit different today. That it's so I don't know what the word is. There's so many, and there's so much
mainstream. Yeah.
So yes, which ones would you like to have studied, either sort of historically or more recently?
Okay, well, I would say, I was interested in subcultures, but again, I was interested in them as part of a wider set of kind of leisure culture. So I would say that, to be absolutely honest, I was more interested in the kind of dipping in and out of subcultures or subcultures in relationship to everyday life. And that was why I wrote that article where I challenged and I really criticized the work of the male subculturists, Dick Hebdige and Paul Willis and Motorbike Boys and Mods and who on, because I wanted to say, I think I said at the time, well, what happens when these boys go home at night? What is their family life? It's not as though there was a romanticism there of the street, as though they were, all the time just like doing these subcultural things. So I think that my honest answer to you is that I wanted to see subcultures more integrated and more embedded in the rhythms of everyday life. And that's why I was actually interested in, for example, I wrote a couple of pieces later on about how punk girls were involved in secondhand clothes markets. And actually I started that in Birmingham, in the rag market in Birmingham, because I was just interested in, well, where do these punks get their clothes? Where do the two-tone bands, the Selector and the Specials in Coventry, where do they find their clothes? And who's producing them? And what does it mean to be making a living in subcultures? So that took me again away from just the spectacular and away from just the kind of drama or theatre of subculture to the idea of subcultural entrepreneurs, or the people who were making a living and kind of, if you like, a kind of subcultural economy. And that was often, you find young women working at that level. So I think, and then also I argued at the time that in many ways, the subcultural field, the subcultural activity was not welcoming to girls. These were male bonding activities, the motorbike boys, it would be, it was a kind of interesting phenomenon to see young women involved in it, but often they were pushed to the side, and whether same with the music industry. So that's why I kind of wanted to get an all-round picture. When you say who else would I have studied, well, more up to date, I think there are lots of sociologists looking at young women's leisure culture and young women on TikTok and looking at the kinds of activities. And I've had many PhD students in my decades at Goldsmiths that have followed up this work. And some of them are my colleagues as well, Rebecca Coleman, who looks at girls and magazines. And so there's a lot of work out there. And there's more recent work on Instagram and on TikTok.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was talking to my A-level students about, we were talking about magazines, and they kind of didn't get the idea of, Jackie and, I don't know, Just 17 was sort of more my era. It was something that they didn't really, they didn't really get that a lot of their sort of ideas about femininity came from social media. So I think that's quite interesting.
Well, I would say that, the genre of the magazine has more or less completely migrated onto social media, and it's become broken up and splintered and completely fragmented. And that then raises quite a lot of methodological questions. If you're a sociologist, how do you study these kind of images on the phone or images on the laptop, and that are fragmented in a way? For example, it was quite easy for me to write a thesis about Jackie magazine. All I had to do was to have my collection of maybe 3 years of the magazine piling up in a shared office. And then that was my data, my raw material. How you do it now is really so complicated, challenging, but not impossible.
God, time is ticking on. I could talk to you for hours. Shall we go for this? Was which of your studies or research do you think has brought you the most joy, or are you most proud of?
Okay, thank you for that question. Well, I'm actually really glad that I did my first work on Jackie magazine. This is something, and it's always been interesting that when I have said in any kind of public, often a more formal space, in some very kind of Oxford, Cambridge kind of setting that I did my thesis on Jackie magazine, particularly to older men. They always kind of like have to stifle a giggle as though, oh my God, you know, why weren't you writing your thesis on Byron or Shelley or Jane Austen? So that I'm really pleased that it just like came to me to study Jackie. So I would stick by that. But what I like more recently is I like the ideas, and I like it was very hard work to do it, but the book, The Aftermath of Feminism, and the chapter Top Girls, I think that was very much in the spirit of Stuart Hall. It was a conjunctural analysis of the Blair years. It was an analysis of the relationship between political culture and popular culture and the economics of neoliberalism. And I did that through the lens of looking at Bridget Jones and Amy Winehouse. So I think I was pleased with that. And then I also liked the article that was also in that book, The Aftermath of Feminism, which I so enjoyed doing, which was a Bourdieusian analysis of the TV program What Not to Wear. Introduced by, what was it, Trinny Woodhull and Susanna Constantine. And I just like took Bourdieu, class analysis, and went through it. So that I enjoyed doing, and I think that worked quite well. So thank you.
I'm going to ask you one final question before we move on. I'm going to ask you about the pandemic. But this pandemic and sociology, this is something that I spoke to Les back about as well. What do you think the impact of the pandemic is going to have on sociology, or what should we look at post-pandemic?
Okay, well, thank you again for that question. Well, I think that what the pandemic revealed to the British public in a very vivid way was it broke through the kind of veneer of neoliberalism to show the value of essential workers. So until the pandemic, there were so many ideological layers and there were so many negative stereotypes about poor people and about people doing low level, what were described as low level jobs. And the pandemic absolutely blew that out of the water when we all realized we were dependent on people driving buses, people cleaning the hospitals, and people working in often low paid work in the supermarkets. Suddenly, the people in supermarkets were given value and recognized as essential workers. And that was it was so important. The question, nurses as well in the NHS. So the question then is, that also gave rise to the idea of that Britain could be a more caring society, that we could give greater respect and value to ordinary people and to people who were living on low incomes and maybe doing 2 or 3 jobs. So there was a moment where it seemed that the sociology of inequality might actually be something that was listened to, and that people who had been invisible had achieved a degree of visibility and respect. Now, of course, 2 years on, it's quite difficult to keep making that argument. But, you know, there are many of my colleagues, people who have written the Care Manifesto about how can we move from a society of individualism to a society of what Judith Butler calls relationality and need and dependency. And up until the pandemic, the idea of being dependent carried a kind of slur of negativity, of like dependency culture or being on welfare. And actually, thinkers and philosophers like Judith Butler made the case many years ago that we are all vulnerable, we are all dependent, and that should be a core value for the society rather than seen as being a negative sign of failure or weakness.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much, Angela. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed speaking to you. I wish I could ask you all of my questions because I've still got some more.
We covered a lot.
Yeah, loads. Yeah, thank you so much from all of us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I'm sure we can invite you again if you want to come back and speak to us another time.
Okay, bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. We're just going to have a quick video from our sponsor, Pupil Progress.
Sociology team. I know they've been working incredibly hard. We've been sponsoring this now for 4 years, nearly 5, I think. I'll cut right to the chase. I just want to really emphasize we've got an incredible offer for all of our schools, that if you are a Pixel school, you are able to use our tracking. And what I'm actually going to show you is we've got the ability to track and monitor progress for any GCSEs, any A-levels, and it's exam board specific. So what we are doing essentially and very, very deliberately is taking away the stress from having to use your own Excel spreadsheets. Everything calculates the grade exactly as the exam board does. You're able to generate individual student reports and produce departmental analysis. It's really dramatically impacting on intervention, students being able to get really clear information as to what grade they're working at and why. I've just downloaded an instant report which gives a complete breakdown of how students are performing and gives me that insight that I need in order to support both my teachers and being able to communicate this with my students. If you go to pupilprogress.com, that's pupilprogress.com, you'll see that on the actual homepage, you can do one of two things. There's a Pixel logo here that you can click on. That's going to take you through to the landing page to give you complete confidence and all the information you need to know that you do get 2 subject areas at 0 cost as part of your Pixel package. You can then click on register for your Pixel subscription. If I actually choose a school now that I know is a Pixel school, I will actually I'll actually be able to show you that it'll bring up your Pixel subscription, and I'll choose my 2 subject areas. Hopefully from this, one of them might be sociology and the other one might be maybe, who knows, English. And then you can actually move forward to the next stage, which is actually just simply registering. We're completely GDPR compliant. And we've got a really, really strong support team that can help with any questions and your setup. So please do visit pupilprogress.com. Thank you so much for your time this evening. And again, we really hope you enjoy the event. Speak soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you for that. So we're going to move on now to Professor Peter Cox from the University of Chester, who's going to be talking to us about social theory in everyday life. Hi, Peter. Welcome.
Hello. Let me just try and find my screen to share. Hopefully that's working. Just means you have to see less of me. What a brilliant set of observations from Angela. That's just set me up for the next week. I'm going to just talk less about my specific subject knowledge. I do social theory, but I do social theory, like Angela was saying, on things about everyday life and culture. My topic of focus I've been working on for the past 15 years is the sociology of cycling. So rather than kind of bore you with the ins and outs of the social theory of cycling, I want to talk a little bit more about why I do social theory and how social theory helps me understand everyday life and how we can bring social theory alive. And I have to start just by explaining why I went to university in the first place. My sixth form college years were a disaster. I've got total awe for anybody who's teaching. I just didn't enjoy it, but put it that way. And I wanted to get out of school as soon as possible. And I got involved with the peace movement and the green movement during the 1980s. And after a few years, but slightly burned out, I found a course that took me back into university and gave me an opportunity to go and study. So I went to I was taught by some brilliant people, and they kind of helped me find out ways of thinking about the worlds that the subcultures, if you like, that I'd lived in. And so I left university, went back into there, and it was only much later I went and did a PhD and kind of stayed in university life for the past 20 years. So I kind of have a love-hate relationship with social theory that sort of focuses around, it's like Longfellow's poem, when she was good, she was very good indeed, but when she was bad, she was horrid. At best, social theory lights up the obscure, lights up those things that we just take for granted and probably don't actually understand why we're doing them or what we're doing when we're doing them. But at worst, it becomes a kind of form of mystification, intellectual self-gratification, pleasurable for the people who are writing it, but for the rest of us, we just look at it and it's kind of words and horrible, complicated things that don't make sense. But as I say, at best, it allows us to see and comprehend better the worlds we live in. And to be honest, the grand theorists, Durkheim, Weber, they kind of live on the shelf. I might take them down occasionally and read against them rather than trying to say, well, what have they got to say? It's going to, well, what is what I understand about the world, how does it bounce against the world that they lived in? Because they don't live in my world. They don't live in the 21st century. Although sort of a lot of my work is much more 20th century than 21st. But they do give us some building blocks. So what I'm interested in is theory and theorizing. The things that allow me or us to make sense of the everyday things we do. Because we all know that sociologists count stuff, they measure stuff, and gathering and analysing the data remains the starting point for what sociologists do. And much of the kind of introductory textbooks explains how sociologists measure stuff, how we gather information, conduct interviews. But measurement only gets us so far. It doesn't answer us the so what questions. You know, when we're confronted by information, we need to go beyond the data and ask, well, why is this so? What's it significant about it being so? Why does that matter? So theory allows us to kind of not just note the different variables, but to assess their relative significance in relation to other things. Theoretical models reveal the underlying processes that are going on. They allow us to move on beyond the particulars of the immediate and the case study that we might have started with and see how that might apply to other stuff. And theory points us to the questions that we need to ask in order to do more than just observe, but to understand, to comprehend what's going on. So I want just to talk, if I've got 4 minutes, I think, 3 little points, 3 examples I've used recently when I'm trying to write about understand cycling. A set of ideas known as SCOT, the social construction technology, studying how people use emerging technologies, how the development of those technologies is organized. I've used it on bicycles. You can equally use it on mobile phones or any other everyday technology. Researchers show that technologies are deeply shaped by social factors, and that provides those theories provide us a set of tools to show that through which we can really understand how technologies are inseparable from the societies that they develop in, and they reflect particular, usually dominant power and values in those societies. And studies of user groups and technologies and user innovation show that if you want to kind of, user innovation often develops as a kind of resistance to mainstream. So the subcultures, the resistant subcultures might have actually moved into everyday resistances as people rethink how they use their own particular issues. And so if we're trying to find solutions and technologies that are going to help us move beyond climate crisis, for example, and sustainable transport, then looking to the mainstream dominant technological suppliers is not going to provide us alternatives to the world that they've already built. So in the case of cycling, for example, all the really interesting stuff folding bikes, cargo bikes, small wheel bikes, they've all come from outside the industry. Same with modular mobile phones. Second example, how do we interact with those technologies? And I've kind of used a lot the idea of an assemblage from Deleuze and Guattari. So rather than thinking about us users on one side and then the technology, the thing that we use on the other, we think in terms of a cyborg, how they are integrated, how they're actually inseparable. With the phone user and the non-phone user are actually different beings, not just, they interact with the world in different ways. It's not just, oh, I've got a technology and you haven't. We become the driver car assemblage Tim Dant writes about. I've written about this, the cyclist and the bicycle rider assemblage, but also some of those take place in context. So to be a rider of a bicycle, you've got to have a space to ride it in. To be a mobile phone equipped human, then we've also got to have that all those infrastructures that support our phone networks. And so there's elements of power played out in that. And the final one is the idea of social practices. That practices, the things that we do every day, Elizabeth Shove and her colleagues point to the way that they're comprised of these materials, competencies, and meanings. So there are physical things involved. There's a brilliant study of just doing the laundry. And what are the materials involved? What are the competencies, the skills and the knowledge? And depending on the different materials you might have, the different types of washing machine or washing facilities, or access to water, we require different competencies. The competencies that allow you to be doing laundry, where I did my field work in India on the banks of the Ganges, then wow, that's completely different from the competencies of laundry around washing and laundry I have at home. So can we cope when we're taken out of those, when the materials change or they demand different competencies? And then there's meanings. What is the value? How are those processes? How are those actions, skills, if you like, and the objects that perform them? How are they given meaning and given value? Angela was talking about the way that a lot of jobs had been written off as kind of unimportant, and suddenly realizing actually care really matters. And practice theory allows us to kind of interrogate these unthought about everyday actions. But the conclusion that Shove comes to is brilliant, because she shows that practices they're not just the sum of people's actions, but as they're constructed out of those materials and competencies and meanings, they can attract users or they can push them away. So they can be attractive or dissuasive, encouraging people to take part, dissuading and discouraging them through setting up barriers. So that's my take on social theory. I'm not gonna carry on any further. Just to say that social theory is not an abstract and difficult thing, or it shouldn't be. Sometimes people try and make it to. It should be a set of tools that can be brought to bear on everyday life and living. Thinking through theory, writing theory, prompts me to ask new questions about the world I see around me. It helps me understand, analyze how things are changing, and to become, therefore, a more viable agent of change in the world. So that's what I've got to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I love the idea of the sociology of cycling, so that when my husband starts saying, oh, she's going on about sociology again, I can say, well, we can talk about the sociology of cycling instead. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
We're going to move on now to Jenny Lewin-Jones from the University of Worcester. She's going to talk to us about the sociology of emotions, which is something I had not really heard of until I saw the University of Worcester tweeting about it. So, yeah, over to you, Jenny.
Hello, thank you. I'm just going to make my slides a bit bigger there. There we go. Okay, can you see my slide up there now?
View.
Can you?
I can see your view, but not the presenter view.
Okay, if I, sorry.
Don't worry.
Let me try again. Okay, how's that?
Yeah, that's
better.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, so hello. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you. So I'm talking about the sociology of emotions. I'm going to share a few key insights from sociology and then talk briefly about three particular academic areas: emotional labour, emotional capitalism, and emotion-based technologies, and then finish with some references and book recommendations. So there's been a big rise in awareness of and discussion of emotions in many disciplines. And this is relevant to so many sociological fields like consumer society, education, health, family life, and work. And I think part of the growth in interest in this is linked to how norms around the expression and sharing of emotions have shifted, and sociologists have got very interested in this. So one of the key insights is that emotions are not just a private, internal, interior matter, but emotions are socially and culturally constructed, and they're often generated and managed by social and collective processes. And there are different expectations, sometimes called emotion norms or feeling rules, such as gendered differences. And these kind of differences are very much linked to expectations that come about through stereotypical and culture-specific beliefs. So in Western cultures, women are perceived of as being more emotionally expressive, which then leads to them being criticised, for example, for not smiling enough. And you hear the shouts of "cheer up, love," and things like that. And it's important to note that intersectionality is also very important. So we see things like the stereotype of the angry Black woman being used as a way of discrediting and silencing people. For example, politicians, people in public life. And next point to make from sociology is, as Ian Burkitt says, emotion is always interwoven in power relations. Emotions are managed or even created and manipulated by powerful organisations who've got vested interests like corporations, governments, media. And this may be a way of ensuring conformity to dominant values through managing people's emotional reactions. And we also get informal control, maybe through family or social groups or peer pressure. I've just got an example there of contrasting examples of public generation and management of emotions. And it was interesting to hear earlier about sociology and the pandemic. So the top left is from the UK, the bottom right from New Zealand. And we see a big difference there in what kind of emotions are being generated, what kind of emotional reaction. So on the left, if you go out, you can spread it, people will die, triggering reactions of fear. And on the right, the unite against COVID, the two languages, the message inspiring loyalty, unity, pride. So we can see a big difference there in that management of emotions. The sociologist who is often described as shining the sociological spotlight on emotions is Ali Russell Hochschild, who came up with this concept of emotional labour, emotions as work that employers require people to do. So individuals at work have to suppress or represent their own private emotions to be consistent with a situation or a role or an expected job function and with what's expected of them socially. And I think her book title, The Managed Heart, really encapsulates that idea. And her classic case study in the early 1980s was with airline cabin crews, looking at how they were required and trained to keep smiling and be charming to customers, whatever they were having to deal with in the course of their work. But I think what is so interesting about Hochschild's insights is that she said most of us have jobs that require some handling of other people's feelings and our own. And in that sense, we're all partly flight attendants. And a lot of people have gone on to draw on her work. The second area I think is really interesting is the notion of emotional capitalism. And I'm drawing here on Eva Illouz's work in her book Cold Intimacies. The main point being that you can't separate the economic from the emotional, that they mutually work together and shape each other. The economic relations are emotional and other relationships have become based on economic models and commodified. And I've got a little personal example to show you here. This was a leaflet that I got sent through the post. So I'm being encouraged to go out and spend my money, but the way they're encouraging me to do that is through emotional capitalism with that, how does that make you feel, Jenny? And the final academic area, one where I think we're seeing a huge rise in interest, is in emotion-based technologies. So automated facial expression analysis, emotion recognition technology. And we can see this in different areas like consumer research, media, transport, work, different areas using these technologies to try and monitor and then respond to people's emotions. And there's really growing sociological concern about inequalities in these technologies. And the fundamental problem here is that these new systems are based on theories about universal emotions. So seeing emotions as biologically hardwired and expressed in the same way by people everywhere. Whereas the increasing research evidence shows that emotions are expressed differently across cultures and societies. And one example of research into inequalities in these kind of systems is about how they can be encoded with racial bias For example, systems that consistently read black people's faces as angrier than white people's faces. And when such systems are used in policing and judicial systems that are already discriminatory, there's obviously a big new danger of perpetuating that discrimination. So I think my overall conclusion is that sociological insights into emotions are becoming ever more important. And I just want to end with a few book recommendations. There are so many research studies coming out. I've picked these 3 books because I think they're very easily accessible, easy to get hold of, and I think as a sort of way into some of these issues, they're a really good read. And then I've also got some slides with some other references, maybe more academic references. And I'm very glad to let anybody have a copy of those if you would like to contact me. And I should end by saying that the ideas I presented here are based on the Sociology of Emotions module that I teach on the BA Sociology course at the University of Worcester. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny. That was really, really interesting. And I can see lots of little links of things to what I've been teaching. So, for example, today I've been teaching a little bit about ethnicity and about Afro-Caribbean boys and how teachers read their mannerisms as being aggressive. And that links quite nicely with what you were saying there. So, yeah, and emotion work is something we would teach in the families topic as well. So that's really interesting. Nice to have something a little bit more up to date. And also it's worth saying that I think the resources will be going on to our TES page. That's what we did last time. So those references of things to read will be on there. So thank you for that. We're going to move on swiftly. I'm really sorry because again, I could listen to you all night, but we've got another speaker, which is Dr. Harry Dwyer, who is from the University of East Anglia, who is looking at post-humanism in digital sociology. Welcome, Harry. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's lovely. This has been so refreshing and interesting so far. Hopefully you can all hear me. I assume so, seeing as speakers popped off. So I haven't got any slides, but I have set myself the task of talking through post-humanism today, which is a big task to do in 10 minutes, but I'm going to give it a bit of a go. And the reason I think it's important to talk about in sociology is because I think it kind of reframes where we place our attention in terms of social theory and challenges our understanding of what is important when we think about the social world. It kind of sounds scary and jarring when you use the word post-humanism. It suggests like some sort of cyborgy anti-human thing that suggests we're moving past humanity, which to me is kind of an exciting idea, but it doesn't necessarily mean we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of social theory. Instead, it's an attempt to move beyond centering language and discourse as like the most important thing when we think about the world around us. Traditional social theory that I'm sure a lot of you have been teaching and thinking about places a lot of value, obviously, in the human and in the ways in which we act and move in the world without necessarily thinking about the way the world interacts with us. And so a lot of my own work, because I'm interested in technology and digital issues, has been trying to think about how we account for the non-human, what role that has in social theory, and what it might mean to put something a little different as the center of our focus and analysis. So I think it's important as well to look beyond the loudest voices in the room, right? Often as social researchers, some of the previous speakers were talking about like how we're trained to spot data and analyze that data. The obvious loud data in the room is the speaking voices, the humans, but we can direct our attention elsewhere and look at different actors as things that shape the social world. And that's what I've been trying to do with my own research. This has been a little abstract so far, so I'm going to give you an example that hopefully some of you can follow a little bit here. So classical sociologist Irving Goffman, right, talks about the ways in which our identities are performances. And it's really interesting as a theory because Goffman suggests it's not about how authentic your identity is, how much it is you presenting yourself authentically in a moment, but how well you negotiating that performance with the audience. If I am, I don't know, watching Eurovision with my mates, I'll be a different version of me to if I'm watching rugby with my dad, or I'll be different wherever I am. And it's about how we sort of present our identities in that moment that's really important to Goffman and his ideas around identity. I really like that. But if we take the extension of the idea that social identity is a performance, we can start to think about the staging that we're on when we perform our identity, the props that we have available to us, the clothing, the lighting, the makeup, the different things that help us give a performance of our identities. And in essence, post-humanism is an attempt to take these quieter elements seriously and give them a bit more focus in research. And it's still in early days. It's getting quite a bit of attention from a range of different fields of study. Some of the most fascinating examples are people like Bruno Latour, who has developed what he calls actor network theory. He had a write-up in the New York Times last year, the year before. So he's very recently. Time is wild at the moment. I have no idea what year we're in anymore. But he had a nice write-up in the New York Times where they were trying to get this idea of what is human, what isn't human, and what makes us individuals. In essence, his actor network theory suggests that everything around us is an actor that is made up of many different things that form it. So it's both an actor and a network at the same time. I am an actor in a network. I am made up of YouTube and different technologies that are forming who I am in this moment, all of which we can sort of trace and pay attention to. And similarly, we can do that with things like tables and desks and technology, try and think about the networks that make those things happen in that moment. It's really interesting, but it's kind of hard to do research that is just tracing networks. Other researchers like feminist physicist Karen Barad has, instead of looking at networks, looked at the ways in which we draw boundaries around things. So what is the boundary of me as a lecturer or you as a teacher? Are you a teacher when you are in the supermarket and your students approach you and look weirdly at you and think you are not in the right place? Like, where is the boundary of you as a teacher, as a social thing? And how do we draw those boundaries, negotiate those boundaries? What pressures are put on us? I think it's really important because previously technology has been seen as a sort of passive tool that we can just make use of. And instead, post-humanism asks us to think about the ways in which these tools act upon us. It's not necessarily saying they have agency or the ability to shape purposefully what we're doing, but that they nonetheless do kind of shape what we do in our day-to-day lives. And I think it's really important when we think about issues like climate change and the ways in which we're moving to perhaps a post-Anthropocene world, a world that is beyond just our footprint on that world. Or when we think about robotics entering into the workforce, and when we think about things like the metaverse, all of these things, I think, pose challenges for sociologists that we need to take seriously. And some of the ways in which I think we can do that is by listening to different voices that aren't just human. My own research has tried to sort of create a theory to do this that I used comic books to try and understand as a way of getting at what our identities are online. Comic books are an attempt to present an image with a gap in the middle and then another image. And we kind of fill those gaps in really interesting ways with our experiences of other texts, with some of our social baggage that we bring with us when we read a bit of media. But it's also guided by the designer, by the artist that kind of shapes what we can read at that moment. And so I extended that into a metaphor to think about technology that probably haven't got time to go into here. But one of the interesting things about post-humanism is it allows us to play around, and there's very little rules about it right now, unlike perhaps classical sociological thinking, which can be very rule-driven. So there's like fascinating work looking at how lobsters impact immigration, or how surgery is conducted in a non-verbal way, or how technology is something that shapes our habits and patterns and ways we can follow that. My own work is progressing on to think about LGBTQIA users and how they navigate spaces of violence online, and how they kind of negotiate thinking about online spaces as physical things that impact them. And I've got PhD students studying things like this, study communities online, and thinking about what the boundaries of those communities are. There's a lot to be done and there's a lot to flesh out, but it's an attempt to not just think of technology as a tool that we use, but instead to look at it as something that shapes us and our actions and interactions. And I think this is particularly useful when thinking about minority groups and technology. For example, metaverse I brought up earlier, there's been a lot of early research into the ways that VR headsets that are used for metaverse make women feel more motion sick than men, or early looks at the ways in which people, females in particular, have faced masses of abuse when they've entered into metaverse technology. The idea of the social construction of technology that Professor Scott mentioned before, a lot of that work has been led by Black and female scholars in the field. And I think it's really worth acknowledging the deep history of digital research that's driven by Black and female scholars, the likes of Sophia Noble, Ruha Benjamin, Francesca Sabande, and many others that are still doing fascinating work, exploring the ways that technology compounds and challenges and changes our experiences of the social world. And a lot of that work explores it through a sort of post-human lens, where we take technology not just as something that is used by people, but something that impacts different people differently. It's not a neutral tool. It's something that shapes different communities, drawing barriers around what's possible and what's acceptable. And perhaps, post-humanism gives us a way of exploring the ways those boundaries might be broken or shifted, even temporarily. I really think there's a lot of potential in it. It's a very nebulous field, a very kind of shaky ground, but at the heart of it, this attempt to at least shift to different voices and to think about who we centralize in any social bit of research is, to me, deeply fascinating. I think I'll stop there because I've kind of blabbed on for 10 minutes, but if there's anything that anyone would like to know, please do get in contact with me.
Thank you for that, Harry. That was really interesting. I teach the sociology of the media. That's one of my sort of more specialist areas. And what you were saying was really interesting. One of the comments from Emma was about, the fact that you've been researching comic books.
Yeah.
That's something that, sometimes students think, it's a bit old fashioned, or, and then to say that there's research in universities about something like that, I think is, going to blow their minds a little bit. And and actually, some of the things you were talking about, even I hadn't really considered that as an area of sociology to be researching. So that was really, really, I know I keep saying everyone's been really interesting, but genuinely, it's really nice to hear all these different areas of sociology. So thank you very much for coming and speaking to us, Harry.
Thanks a lot for organising this. It's been lovely.
Our final speaker for this evening is Ryan Scotes from the University of Coventry. Hello, Ryan.
Hi.
So Ryan's going to be talking to us about masculinities, which I think is quite a useful area. We've talked about feminism with Angela earlier, but what I find is with the boys that I teach, they will say to me, "But Miss, where's the research about masculinity?" So hopefully, Ryan, you're going to give me a bit of an answer for that.
Excellent. Yeah, I hope so. So thank you for having me. So this is one of the areas that I research in and have done for a number of years. And I initially sort of came to it because, like Kerry said, there's all this work on sort of women and how they are. And it wasn't until I got to university that I started to read about masculinities, and it really spoke to me as an interesting area. So anyone who studies masculinities will likely come across this model. So this is Connell's hierarchy of masculinity, and I'm not going to spend too long on this because there's a good chance you may have come across it before, but the fundamental aspects of it are that you have a hegemonic masculinity. So there is a pinnacle, an archetype of masculinity that in a given society men are encouraged towards. and other expressions of masculinity, they are relegated lower down the hierarchy, so they are not as valued. And although some people may support that version of masculinity, very few people can actually get to it. So this was some of the initial theorizing, kind of late 80s, early 90s, about masculinities. But a lot of what Connell talked about, it doesn't speak to young people today in the same way that it maybe did in the past. So Connell described a version of masculinity that was endorsed, and that was very much what we might today call like the alpha male. So if we think tough and stoic and emotionless and strong, potentially aggressive and violent, and all of these things. But we don't kind of see this in the same way anymore. And so in the field of masculinities research, there are starting to emerge like other models to try and explain how men are stratified or not stratified, as the case may be. So there is a theory which has kind of come out of Connell's ideas. And essentially what we have is, within Western societies, as we have a growing acceptance of homosexuality and LGBT, well, more LGB to an extent T, but as we have a growing acceptance of gayness and being gay is okay, then no longer is it harmful to a boy's masculinity to adopt that which would have previously been seen as feminine. So you have things like boys being able to talk to each other, or demonstrate their emotions, or be physically intimate with other men in both sexual and non-sexual ways. So what Eric Anderson, who is the architect of this theory, suggests is that no longer do we have a hierarchy like Connell suggested, but you now have multiple versions of masculinity, all kind of sitting side by side. So previously, if you would demonstrate an alternative version of masculinity, this would kind of relegate you in the eyes of other men. Whereas now there is no single hierarchy. And so although some young men are going to endorse that kind of alpha, traditional, orthodox version of masculinity, not all men will. And they are not going to kind of necessarily deride others for not accepting how they understand masculinity. So we get to see a lot more variation in what men can do, because feminine it's no longer sort of homosexualizing. Previously, if boys would do something that girls would do, they'd be called gay, and being gay was bad. Take away that being gay is bad, and you have a lot more wiggle room for boys to explore with their behaviors. And you kind of see this in how they behave and the things that they do. And I thought this was a really nice graphic that kind of explained some of the ways in which boys are kind of behaving now. And it's perhaps a little bit difficult to see, but I also thought this was a potentially quite good resource for you to be able to bring into classrooms. It's kind of explained with graphics and quite short language. It's very accessible for what is otherwise a fairly dense academic theory, but it's talking about how men are doing things differently. So they've got that physical affection, they care about their appearance, or some of them care about their appearance and some of them don't, and the ones that do don't really care what the ones that don't care are doing. We also have a kind of social arena where popularity is no longer dictated through kind of violence and aggression and domination of other boys, but it's more about personality, it's about charisma, it's about how well you can mix between different groups. Now, all of this is not to say that men are 100% perfect now and that we live in a kind of utopia, but it is a much more modern way of looking at masculinities. I think when we talk to students and when we teach Connell's hierarchy of masculinities, although this fits in some arenas, it doesn't really speak to the lives of a lot of the young men. And yeah, they don't really necessarily see themselves like that or see that around themselves. Or at least they are moving away from that. And in fact, with my first year students today, we were discussing masculinities and whether school kind of creates this closed institution where you cannot escape that hierarchy. But as you get older, as you go to college and sixth form, you've got that freedom. You can choose who you're friends with. And so that freedom allows you to perhaps escape those constraints. And maybe that is why we see more kind of adherence to those traditional markers of masculinity amongst younger people, and a sort of breaking out of that as students get older and mature more. So just thinking about how we see this in society, it comes out through a lot of different ways. So we've got famous people, so people like Barack Obama, who are happy to say they are a feminist. They stand up for women's rights. We also have ad campaigns. So recently there was the Gillette campaign, and in the sort of mid 2010s, you had a new campaign from Lynx where they talked about finding yourself, and they presented lots of different versions of masculinity in a hope to speak to a wider market of people who were perhaps a bit disillusioned with, if you remember the old Lynx adverts, where essentially the pitch was spray our deodorant and people will have sex with you. So they're kind of moving past that. So you can see it's coming out through the products that are trying to be sold. We've got Ben, who recognize and will actively say that they are pro women's rights, that they are feminist. We have in the middle here the Warwick rowers. So these are university rowers, and each year for a long time they have created a sort of soft core semi-nude calendar, and their proceeds go towards sexual minorities in sport and making it a better place for them. So we can see masculinity is no longer based around that kind of really hard and stoic idea of masculinity that's often pushed. But at the same time, as I mentioned before, we have different versions of masculinity and different people adhering to them. So that kind of stoic version, that traditional version, is still there. And you see this coming through the backlash. So the idea that things have gone too far, that feminists are taking over, or men's rights are being eroded. So at the same time as more progressive things happening, you do also have a backlash as well. And this kind of really starts tapping into some of the sort of more fringe internet groups as well. So in the top right here, we've got the shooter from Plymouth, who was part of the incel subculture, or whether we call it a subculture is debatable. But we've also got pickup artists. We've got men going their own way. So you have, as things get better and more equal, you do also have a resistance to that and a sort of pushback against feminism, which has always been there, but is becoming quite a lot more visible through means of the internet. And then finally, very quickly, so we've talked about Connell's hierarchy of masculinity. We've talked about Anderson's inclusive masculinities, where the hierarchy is no longer in place. And then finally, we have this idea of hybrid masculinities. So this essentially is a theory which recognizes that men are doing better. They are doing more inclusive things. They are sort of standing up for women's rights or being inclusive of sexual minorities. But the hybrid masculinity scholars, they question how genuine this is. They question whether it will lead to any meaningful change, or whether it is just covert oppression through a supposedly progressive lens. And so that is an extremely quick whirlwind tour of kind of some of the current debates and current ways in which people are bringing theory to kind of try and understand modern masculinities. And so hopefully I've presented a few different ways that might speak to your students a bit more than Connell's theory, which is getting on for kind of 25 years old now.
Yes, thank you very much, Ryan. I know I still made a comment about we do about gender and identity in school. So what you were saying about that is something that is part of the A-level syllabus. So that's quite interesting. I was also making some notes for the sociology of media, where we do about representation of gender. And I have to say, I'm really guilty of just going on about women quite a lot. So you've given me some things to think about a little bit more in terms of representation of men. I've written down the links advert as well.
I think it's really interesting because oftentimes companies and industry, they won't necessarily change unless there is profit to be made. And so them trying to jump on the bandwagon, people do view it cynically, and maybe rightly so, but they view society as changing, and therefore, we need to change so we can tap into more customers. So it's a really interesting lens to view things through.
Thank you so much for coming and talking to us. It's been absolutely fantastic, really interesting. I'm going to sum up then, finish off. So I've learned loads today, and I've seen some really great comments on Facebook and Twitter. Yes, thank you to our sponsors, Teachers Love Stationery and Pupil Progress. This recording will be available on YouTube, and I think there will be a link on our website. Thank you very much to Angela at the beginning, to Peter, to Jenny, to Harry and to Ryan for giving up their time to come and speak to us. Thanks to the rest of the team of organising, Kim, who's done a great job with the tech when mine failed. And thanks to Carly, who's on the Twitter and Facebook accounts. I'm just going to mention before I go that we have an in-person event planned for the 25th of June. Details to be confirmed. If you're interested, follow us on Twitter. That's where we're probably most active. Thank you, and hope to see you again soon.